Is this the dawn of a new era? Are we facing the very things that we all said could never happen here in the United States? Whatever the case, at home and around the world, there's a clarion call to stand for freedom. Welcome to the Frontlines of Freedom. I'm your host, Mawarire. So it's only the beginning of the new year, but worldwide, national elections are now underway. In fact, there has already been a very significant one that was decided in Taiwan.
Opposition KMT candidate Mawarire has just conceded defeat.
The winner has pledged to keep the country independent, no matter the threats coming from Beijing. That's a decisive win for democracy. But it's here in the United States that the November election is a referendum on democracy. Perhaps unbelievable. Nonetheless, it's true. How things turn out here will send signals that will either strengthen autocrats everywhere or re-energize democracy movements around the world. My next guest argues that this election is certainly such a referendum, but also much more important than that. Very much more important. Bill Kristol is a well-known conservative who for some time now has rejected Donald Trump and all that he stands for. He co-authored a piece posted in the Bulwark arguing that the very nature of the American constitutional framework is at risk in November. Bill, welcome to the Frontlines of Freedom. You've talked about a possibility of constitutional failure in the coming election if Trump wins. What exactly are we talking about here?
So I think it's, people say, oh, come on, this is the U.S., we're not going to collapse, it's not going to be Venezuela or something. And there's some truth to that, obviously. This is a big country with a long tradition of liberal democracy and free markets. We have a huge private sector, a huge civil society. It's not that easy to have everything be undercut or subverted that quickly. So it's not as if on January 21st, 2025, suddenly we're going to wake up and, we'll have no freedoms. But could we have a erosion of those freedoms? Could we have a Justice Department that goes after people Trump doesn't like, that goes after businesses that don't go along with Trump's agenda? Could we have a Defense Department where Trump starts to meddle in military promotions, where the whole notion of civilian control of the military, but also of the military obeying the law, the rule of law, starts to get eroded? There's so many things here we take for granted. I think one thing Americans need to wake up to is it's nice that we think we're an exceptional nation and we have an exceptional history in many ways, and we have exceptional things about us even today, but we're not immune. We're not immune to the temptations and dangers of authoritarianism and demagoguery. We're not immune to the possibility of democratic guardrails collapsing or being eroded and being weakened. And Trump and his supporters are really determined, I think, to erode and weaken them.
As someone who, I would describe you now as someone who's a former Republican. Do you see the Republican Party recovering from Trump? Do they want to recover from Trump?
For now, they don't want to recover from Trump. For now, they want to win under Trump. So under Trump's leadership. If Trump loses, I think it's hard to know. How much damage does that do to him? He's not young. Would his successors fight over his legacy? Would that allow for less authoritarian types to emerge in the midst of that fighting? I think that's a real possibility. So I think it's hard to say. I'm not very optimistic in the short term. The Trumpism now runs pretty deep in the Republican Party, unfortunately.
Right. He promises, or at least kind of jokes about being a dictator on day one. Is that serious, or do you think it's just, kind of politicking and maybe, playing games?
I think it's typical of Trump's demagoguery, which is pretty clever. He does enough to tell his authoritarian supporters, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with just saying, I'll be a dictator, but only for one day and only on two issues. He does enough to signal to them that he is going to do much more than a typical politician who works within the rules of the game would do. But then he says, I'm only a dictator for a day, and it's only to build the border wall and drill for oil. But that's of course ridiculous. He has said in speech after speech that he wants retribution on his enemies. He's going to use the Justice Department. He's not going to do that. He's not going to tolerate the kind of behavior from the military that happened in the first term, which is the military following the law and not following all of Trump's whims. He's got people working with him and allied with him who are looking at replacing tens of thousands of civil servants. Some people who they look at Trump and he's goofy and he's old and he sometimes isn't very coherent and they minimize the danger. But I think that's a big mistake. There's now a pretty big infrastructure under him that is authoritarian or wants to be somewhat authoritarian, if one wants to be a little milder in the characterization. They admire Orban. They talk about that all the time. They certainly want to pull out of stop helping Ukraine and let Putin win there. What are the implications of that for the world? I mean, just that. Leave everything else aside, to simply give up. Well, what would the world look like if the U.S. just says, we're giving up on this country whom we've pledged to help, who's fought valiantly, who's held its own, who's lost a little bit of ground, obviously over 2 years. I mean, lost the original ground, it's won some of it back, but it is holding its own. We're just pulling the plug. I mean, what does every ally, every freedom fighter, every pro-democrat around the world start to think about the reliability of the United States?
You bring in Ukraine. You were part of a conversation some time ago that spoke about seizing the assets that Russia has to rebuild Ukraine. Walk us through how possible that is and how important that is, to happen.
Yeah, I mean, our RDI has done, the New York Democracy Initiative has done important work on this, and I think it's doable, and I think the administration is edging towards it. As often with this, just to be clear, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian assets that are now frozen because Russia is behaving the way Russia's been behaving for the last 2 years, behaving badly for longer than that, but much more dramatically since February 24th, 2022. And so they're frozen in banks in the US and in Europe mostly. And the question is, are we going to give them back to Putin? Are we just going to leave them frozen for years? Or why not take them and give them to the Ukrainians? Let the Ukrainians use those Russian assets to defend themselves against Putin. And I think we've made progress in making that argument. I think it's legally defensible. And I think the administration is showing more interest in it. So as often with this administration, they end up often doing more or less the right thing, but they take longer than they should to do it.
Well, again, talking globally, there's, by some estimation, about 50 elections that are taking place this year in 2024. In fact, some have already happened, Taiwan being one of them. Your sense of democracy globally as these elections take place, where do you see it going?
The elections aren't all a bad news story. I mean, the authoritarians have won some. We're at risk here in the U.S., but the Democrats have won some. And so I don't think people all over the world are being brainwashed into becoming authoritarians. It is unfortunately the case that Democrats have to win every election in a sense. Authoritarians only have to win 1 or 2, and then there aren't that many more elections, right?
Do you think Xi Jinping will still move on Taiwan this year, 2024, or at least somehow react to the fact that they've chosen to continue to be independent and to pretty much be aligned with the West?
He'll certainly react, and I think he already is, and putting more pressure on Taiwan, trying to make them pay a price for their choice. Friends of mine who know much more think it's unlikely he'll act militarily this year or in a huge way with a dramatic blockade. I think he wants to see what will happen here in our election first, and Putin's waiting on that too. I come back, we began with the domestic elections here, and I think that is awfully important. I mean, Putin is waiting for Trump to win. He hopes Trump will win. He may not win, but he hopes Trump will win in November. If Trump wins, Putin figures he wins in Ukraine. Xi Jinping is a little more complicated. Trump pretends to be anti-China, but at the end of the day, he cares about trade. At the end of the day, if the U.S. isn't willing to help Ukraine, we're not going to do much to help Taiwan.
Bill, I want to move to the Middle East. The Houthis, get support to continue attacks on, the situation that's happening there. What do you make of the rise of the Houthis, or at least the what seems to be a re-strengthening of that group, a terrorist group, I must add?
Yeah, it is a terrorist group, obviously, and a rebel group in Yemen. I mean, this is a very complicated situation, which I'm certainly not expert on, but I would just say, I think the way you put it was correct. A lot of it is what seems to be happening, but seeming matters in perception matters. Perception right now is we have this small terrorist group backed by Iran that seems to be lobbing missiles and drones and so forth at international ships, legally traversing, legally doing business in international waters. And we bombed them once or twice, a couple of times, but we haven't stopped them yet. And that's very bad. I mean, if people have the sense that you can just get away with this, how many other groups are there that might try to do this? How much more would Putin and Xi Jinping try to finance others to do this? It's been a core American interest for 2 centuries to preserve freedom of the seas. It's been a core interest of really all civilized nations, actually. It's almost the definition of war when you don't have freedom of the seas. If you think about World War I and World War II and what happened there in terms of sinking transatlantic shipping and so forth. So it's really the perception, I think, is that we don't seem to be strong enough to deal with it. And that's a dangerous perception to let go around the world. And it's a dangerous perception even here at home, because it sort of leads then to people saying, well, I guess we just can't do much, we just pull out. So leave aside dealing with Iran more effectively, which would be very important. I mean, we can't even deal with this pretty small proxy of Iran very effectively, it seems. Now, look, it's easy. I've been in government. It's easy for me to sit here and say, we should do this, we should do this. It seems like we're not doing enough. And obviously in the real world, these things are much more complicated. And it's not that easy to just snap your fingers and use military force to solve these problems or use diplomatic pressure to solve these problems. But I do think the Biden administration underestimates how much damage is being done to U.S. interests and U.S. credibility by letting this go on.
And then you spoke about Iran, and of course how the Houthis are a proxy of Iran. The attack that the Houthis are also launching on Israel, what do you make of that?
I mean, I guess I'd put it this way. Look, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are very upset by Biden administration's policies on Iran, and I think they're often right to be. But again, you can excuse people. The administration might make a calculation that we're doing a lot in Russia, we're doing a lot in Asia, we're helping Israel. We can't deal with everything all at once. So as Secretary of State Blinken says, we don't want a larger war, so we're going to be a little bit softer, if I can use that, colloquially, speak colloquially, on Iran than we are in some other areas. That's you're in government, you can't do everything, right, all at once. What I think the Biden administration underestimates is if you look as if you're not standing up in a lot of different places. Ukraine aid has been stalled for 4 months on the Hill. China's complicated, but I wouldn't say we've really got our act together in terms of necessarily dealing with the China threat. Putin and Russia, Ukraine, obviously centrally important. Iran, we've mentioned, other parts of the world, Venezuela, other things going on where we seem to be unable to stop people from doing things they shouldn't be doing. Even this recent Pakistan-Iran exchange of bombing or missiles, which I don't really know enough about to comment intelligently on, except that it generally creates the impression that everything's spinning out of control.
I want to bring back Russia into this Middle East situation. How do you see how they're playing or what they're hoping for?
I think they're happy to have us look weak. They're happy to have us tied down. They're happy to have Israel tied down, actually, in Gaza. And China, I think, has the same incentives. I don't know that they have much of a, positive agenda really for themselves in that part of the world. It's more a weaken the U.S., weaken U.S. allies, make people doubt U.S. commitments, create more chaos. 70, 80 years ago, a U.S. Secretary of Defense said about the Soviet Union then that, if you don't quite know you can't understand everything they're doing, just assume that they always have an interest in creating chaos. And I think that's true. It sounds a little simple, but it's actually, Russia has all kinds of strategic interests and plots in mind, some of them subtle, some of them complicated, but often they also just want to make our life miserable because they think the weaker we are, the stronger they are. And they're not wrong, right? If people here get exhausted by all the challenges around the world and stop helping Ukraine the way we should, that benefits Russia. So they're not wrong to think that just creating chaos does them some good. The authoritarians work together. They're very different. Islamic republics and secular, dictatorships, but they're able to work together. Their common interest is weakening liberal democracies. Liberal democracies have to work together. I'm no expert, and I don't have a strong view about exactly what institutional structures are needed. There could be many, and there are some, and they can overlap, and they can be different. And some of them can be civil society focused. Some of them can be focused on helping dissidents and freedom fighters. Some of them can be much more kind of straightforward, strengthening the institutions of government, and of course arming the Ukrainians and things like that. But I think we need a somewhat different mindset than we've had for the last 30 years. We are in a global struggle, and we need to look. It doesn't mean we need to, intervene everywhere. Of course, it doesn't mean that every part of the struggle is going to be as easy to affect as every other part. I mean, in the Cold War, we had losses as well as victories. There were places we, in a sense, accommodated or didn't stand up for our friends as much as maybe we should have or would have liked to, because it was just we were standing up in other places, and there are limits on what people can do. But you've got to understand it. The one thing good, the Cold War, we understood that it was a global struggle. And we said, okay, we can't quite do what we'd like to do here to help Hungarians in 1956, but we do need to do this, So, but understanding that it's a global struggle is really key. That's where I think Democrats from around the world, freedom fighters from around the world, like yourself, dissidents from around the world, coming together to share understanding, to share tactics, to just reinforce each other, to publicize each other's struggles, to create a feeling of solidarity. I think that's very important.
Well, those are great words of hope, Bill Kristol. Thanks so much for stopping by, and hopefully we can call on you again soon. Thanks, my friend.
No, thank you. Congratulations on this show, and look forward to seeing you off camera soon.
The social media platform X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, is rolling out a new documentary series. And their choice of host has me saying, what the hell, man?
Ladies and gentlemen,
right-wing Trump fascists
to the Russians and the Chinese
are controlled by the same exact people,
completely free of charge.
What the hell, man? X is launching a new show with, as they introduce her, 4-term Congresswoman and former presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard. And what exactly is Tulsi's unique point of view, which X seems so keen on sharing? Perhaps it's her unique point of view that Joe Biden's nomination of Americans from diverse backgrounds to his cabinet makes him as bad as Hitler. Yep, you heard me right.
It's based on genetics, race, based on your blood, your genes. And where do we see that connection? Well, these are the very same geneticist core principles embodied by Nazism and Adolf Hitler.
Oh, and speaking of Hitler, Tulsi knows a thing or two about murderous dictators. She loves them. She's done apologetics for Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
It could have been avoided if President Biden and NATO had done exactly what you were just talking about in agreeing, hey, we're going to take NATO off the table for Ukraine.
She even met Syrian strongman Bashar al-Assad twice. And she publicly denies the well-documented poison gas attacks that he launched against his own people. So, given all of that baggage, introducing Tulsi Gabbard as just a 4-term Congresswoman and presidential candidate without mentioning she's also a war crimes denier is a little like introducing her buddy, Bashar al-Assad, as an eye doctor. I mean, I guess it's accurate, but it's not exactly complete, is it? I suppose you rack up a lot of unique POVs when you run all over the political spectrum as Tulsi has done. She's gone from being a Bernie supporting left-wing Democrat to campaigning for far-right election deniers. From the outside, that path may look a bit hard to follow, but it actually makes perfect sense. You see, people like Tulsi, who traffic in corrosive conspiracy theories and who shill for the worst autocrats tend to be very similar. These people crave attention. That's what makes them so open to the influence of dictators. This is a person who will do anything to get in front of an audience. Look, America is a free country, Well, so long as some of Tulsi's friends don't get their way. And Tulsi Gabbard has every right to air any of the nonsense that comes to her mind. But you, my friends, you can choose not to watch her show. Instead, we at the Frontlines of Freedom have actually taken the liberty of compiling a short list of hobbies that you could take up with the time that you've saved by not watching Tulsi's new show. You could get your pilot's license. You could try extreme ironing, or maybe learn to speak Elvish. Or even launch your very own dead-on-arrival presidential campaign. Wait, actually, maybe give that one a second thought. But as for you, Tulsi, and the folks at X who think this is a good idea, what the hell? Now, before we close, there's a German expression that I want to share with you. Schadenfreude. Say it with me. Schadenfreude. That means satisfaction or joy when bad things happen to bad people. Case in point, that recent Taiwanese election I spoke about at the beginning of this edition, it's good news for democracy, but it's bad news for Xi Jinping of China. You can almost feel his pain when the news arrived in Beijing. Schadenfreude. Speaking of democracy, there's more good news. This time, it's coming from Guatemala. There, a pro-democracy leader has won the election, defying the odds. Bernardo Arevalo assumes office despite a concerted effort to rob him of that victory.
Today, Guatemalans have hope. We are celebrating the return of the feeling of hope in the streets of our country.
Look, I can't overstate both of these developments. But to me, as a fighter for democracy, and as someone who participated in elections that were rigged, and in many, many cases, the votes just did not count, these outcomes are a very, very big deal. And as much as we talk about the fight for democracy, to actually achieve it, as in Guatemala, no matter how many forces are stacked against you, is an inflection point. Remember how I promised some good news? Well, this is part of what that looks like. Thanks for joining me again here on the Frontlines of Freedom, and see you again soon, my friends. Goodbye.